Hello, it's a great pleasure to welcome you to this lecture by Professor Mark Roseman of Indiana University. I'm Michael Rothberg, and I have the privilege of holding the 1939 Society Samuel Goetz Chair in Holocaust Studies at UCLA. Today's virtual lecture is our annual 1939 Society Lecture in Holocaust Studies. I'm grateful to the 1939 Society, to the UCLA Alan D. Leve Center for Jewish Studies, and to the center staff for making this possible. Mark Roseman is a distinguished professor of history and Pat M. Glaser Chair in Jewish Studies at Indiana University. Professor Roseman was educated at Cambridge University and the University of Warwick, where he received his PhD in history with a dissertation on mining in the Ruhr region after the Second World War. Before coming to Indiana in 2004, he taught at Kiel University and the University of Southampton in the UK. After two early books on labor relations and youth rebellion in modern German history, Professor Roseman has increasingly turned his attention to National Socialism and the Nazi genocide. One of the world's leading historians of the Holocaust, Professor Roseman is the author or editor of numerous books on that topic in English and German. His most recent book in English is Lives Reclaimed, a story of rescue and resistance in Nazi Germany, which was published in 2019 by Metropolitan Books. A revised German edition appeared in 2020. The Past in Hiding, Memory, and Survival in Nazi Germany appeared in 2001 with Metropolitan and was translated into German and Italian. His 2002 book, The Wannsee Conference and the Final Solution, A Reconsideration, was published by Penguin Press and appeared in 15 international editions in Poland, Brazil, Portugal, Germany, and Hungary, among other places. While preparing this introduction, I discovered that UCLA Special Collections holds a copy of this book because it was owned by the writer Susan Sontag and contains her notes, which seems to me like the ultimate recommendation for a book of this sort. Professor Roseman has co-edited a number of important volumes, including Beyond the Racial State in 2017 and Jewish Responses to Persecution, 1933 to 1938 in 2010. He's currently general editor of what looks like it will be a definitive collection, the 4-volume Cambridge History of the Holocaust. These books are accompanied by a multitude of other important publications and scholarly journals, edited collections, and public-facing venues, such as the Times Literary Supplement. Among those many publications, I want to draw particular attention to two quite impressive works that also illustrate several of the signal characteristics of Mark Roseman's work. In The Past in Hiding, Roseman acts as a kind of detective weaving together the threads of a remarkable and unlikely story of survival, that of Mariana Strauss-Ellenbogen, a German Jewish woman from Essen, who went underground in 1943 and was one of a quite small number of Jews to survive in hiding outside of Berlin. In Lives Reclaimed, Roseman narrates the related and equally unlikely story of a group that Roseman calls, quote, a circle of vegetarian, teetotaling utopians. Indeed, Mariana Strauss was survived in part because of the actions of this group, the Bund, or League, Community for Socialist Life, a little-known collective that emerged during the Weimar Republic and continued through the Nazi period and into post-war Germany. Despite their modest numbers, as Roseman compellingly recounts, the Bund nonetheless managed to rescue a small number of Jews and to offer various kinds of resistance and solidarity in the face of totalitarian order in Nazi Germany. Both of these books, The Past in Hiding and Lives Reclaimed, exemplify Roseman's lucid and readable prose, which remains accessible without ever becoming simplistic. These books also reveal Roseman's admirable ability to start with singular and even marginal stories and to use them to produce insights that get to the heart of the dynamics of National Socialism and the Holocaust. These stories further illuminate the complex and often contradictory relationships between history and memory, that is, between unfolding events and the retrospection with which actors later recall them. The scope of Roseman's writings in these books, as well as in works such as his study of the Wannsee Conference, mark his contribution to what the UCLA historian of the Holocaust, Saul Friedlander, called an integrated history of the Holocaust. That is, his writings encompass both the perspective of the perpetrators and that of the victims, while simultaneously bringing bystanders, rescuers, and others who often receive far less attention into the picture. In today's lecture, Mark Roseman will assess recent scholarship on perpetrators. His lecture is titled Ordinary Monsters, the Holocaust and the Puzzle of Perpetration. I'm really looking forward to it. So welcome, Mark. The floor is yours.
Thanks so much for that really very nice introduction, Mike, even by the normal standards. Thank you. And I'm so sorry that that we couldn't have this live. Circumstances in the end made it impossible, but I very much regret it, and I do hope that at some point we will manage to be on the same campus. And in any case, thank you for the invitation. And thank you to all the staff who made this possible. I'm going to share my screen because I have a PowerPoint to help render some of the points I'm making a bit more visible. So let me just do that. Michael, you'll tell me if the screen is not working, but I hope it's visible. My most sacred, beloved, worn-out, blessed, cherished mother, an anguished David Syrakowiak trapped in the Łódź ghetto, scorched onto the pages of his diary in September 1942, has fallen victim to the bloodthirsty German Nazi beast. The beasts who carried out strip searches of the women in Mary Berg's house committee did not leave until 2 a.m., carrying a scanty loot of a few watches. Outside at work, the men are being tortured most bestially, noted the communist Jew Leve in her Bergen-Belsen diary in 1944. The German beasts stick to their preferred methods, terrible beatings and coarse hysterical insults. You should have seen their faces, Eva Hoffmann's mother said to her young daughter sometime in the early 1950s. They were not really human. Even the reflective Primo Levi noted in his The Drowning and the Saved, almost all, but not all, had been deaf, blind, and dumb, a mass of invalids surrounding a core of ferocious beasts. This kind of language resonates also for the general public, certainly in Britain, with its insatiable appetite for things Nazi. Recently in the Daily Mirror, following the find of some photographs taken by a British soldier shortly after liberation, we find Nazi monsters revealed in chilling, never-before-seen photos of world's most evil killers. Franz Hössler and Irma Gräser were among the perpetrators captured on camera. Not to be outdone, the Daily Mail discovered hidden photos on the German-occupied Channel Island of Alderney. Posing outside Lloyd's Bank, the Nazi monsters who murdered thousands. But if we ask teachers of the Holocaust about their go-to text for understanding perpetrators, it's likely to be Ordinary Men, Christopher Browning's marvelous book, now in its 3rd edition, the most commonly used text when it comes to teaching the Week in Your Holocaust course on perpetrators. Despite having taken place 25 years ago, the famous debate between Christopher Browning and Daniel Goldhagen about the German policemen called upon to murder Jews in occupied Poland continues to shape our perception. In that debate, Browning, with his meticulous use of the sources, clearly had the upper hand, conveying a picture of ordinary folk responding to peer pressure and group dynamics to become hardened killers. Yet the conclusion about the ordinariness of the perpetrators, while on some level incontestable, on another must leave historians unsatisfied. After all, it was Goldhagen who offered the historical explanation for the perpetrators' behavior, albeit with the implausible claim that German culture had been imbued long before the Nazis by a distinctive eliminatory anti-Semitism that made killing Jews a natural step. Browning's core explanation was based on a more universal social psychology that could apply anywhere. But had the preceding years of Nazi rule really had so little effect? Moreover, although ordinary men remains the go-to concept, somewhat paradoxically, alongside it, there now seems to be a new consensus that Hannah Arendt got it wrong when in writing about the Eichmann trial, she called Eichmann banal. Don't be fooled. Eichmann was a monster, wrote Guy Walters a few years ago in the British Daily Telegraph. Walters was reacting to a film about the Eichmann trial called The Eichmann Show, and to comments by actor Martin Freeman. Freeman played the producer of the original coverage of the trial and said, "The film teaches us that people who can be responsible for these terrible things aren't monsters and don't have two heads. They look, sound, and often think similarly to us, which is the scariest thing of all." No, Walters rebuts. Ultimately, we should realize that some people are not normal and they do not think like us. For want of a better word, the Eichmanns of this world are indeed monsters. For sure, Walters, the author of Hunting Evil, the Nazi war criminals who escaped and the hunt to bring them to justice, is, as far as I know, not an academic historian. But following the work of David Cesarani, Bettina Stangmeth, and others, Arendt is now often regularly criticized. Eichmann presented himself in Jerusalem as an ordinary bureaucrat whose sole fault was to have faithfully and loyally executed his orders. And Eichmann is criticized for not having detected the zealot behind the mask. Now, there are, of course, ways of reconciling our acceptance of the ordinary and our rejection of Eichmann's banality. But there is undoubtedly a tension here between the picture of ordinary men being jostled into action on the one hand and that of zealots and extremists on the other. In short, ordinariness, and more broadly, the nature and motivation of the perpetrator, is up for grabs. Until the 1990s, historians did not talk about the perpetrators and focused instead on the origins of the final solution and the nature of the political system that could produce a policy of genocide. While they disagreed about how and when a decision to murder European Jews was taken, they mostly took for granted that once that point was reached, there would be people willing to carry it out. Even after research on perpetrators became a major subfield of Holocaust research in the 1990s, senior figures in the discipline like Hans Mommsen continued to feel that looking at perpetrators rather than system dynamics was going to be of limited value. No one would argue this in quite this way today, and a huge body of work since the mid-1990s has engaged with the perpetrators. Yet, as we will see, in some ways Mommsen was onto something. The question of what the perpetrators were like and what motivated them turns out to be very hard to disentangle from the political and social history of Nazi Germany, of the countries it occupied or allied with. In the meantime, three things have become very clear. The first is that a large and diverse body of people were involved in the final solution, far larger and more heterogeneous than formerly assumed. Until the 1980s, if scholars thought about the executors of murder at all, they had in mind mainly the small group of staff operating in the extermination camps. But as they came to explore the murders in the occupied Baltic and Soviet territories, in Poland outside the extermination camps, in the Balkans and elsewhere, they uncovered the very significant number of SS and police units involved in shooting Jews, Roma, Sinti, and ostensible partisans. They also highlighted the Wehrmacht's role in the Holocaust, which, particularly since the crimes of the Wehrmacht exhibition in 1996, has been shown to be far more extensive than many used to imagine. The circle of participants goes still further. In the closing phase of war, local Nazi officials, Hitler Youth, and Home Army were also involved. Wendy Lower and others have revealed the significance of women as killers, or as aiders and abettors of the killers. We're talking about a good 250,000 German and Austrian perpetrators. Moreover, in the last 10 years, historians have also explored the very extensive role of non-German collaboration in making the Holocaust possible, from high-level officials to violent neighbors. Together, this work has transformed our understanding of who the perpetrators were. The second fundamental insight from recent work is how diverse were the victims of Nazi racial violence. Since the 1980s, we've learned a great deal more about the scale of euthanasia of people with mental and physical disabilities and its continuation in camps and hospitals even after September 1941, when Hitler ended the murders in dedicated centers. The scale and intensity of violence against non-Jewish civilians in occupied Poland and in Soviet territories was staggering. In Poland, civilian authorities and Himmler security forces were key. In the Soviet Union, the Wehrmacht's role was central. The fact that 3 million Soviet prisoners of war died of starvation, disease, or shooting in German hands, 2 million of them by the end of 1941, is remarkable. Although never fully implemented, we now know that at a notorious meeting in May 1941, civilian and military planners were counting on the deaths of tens of millions of Soviet civilians as a result of German commandeering of food supplies. In terms of the proportion of relevant population murdered, the Porajmos is close to matching the Holocaust in terms of the elimination of the Roma and Sinti, with probably over 200,000 victims in total, and many national populations in Germany, the Czech Republic, the Baltic states, and so on, entirely or almost entirely eliminated. Himmler's General Plan East foresaw the decimation of Baltic and East European populations should Germany have defeated the Soviet Union. Whilst that was not realized, thankfully, all told, perhaps 12 to 14 million people were murdered under German rule. None of this is to challenge the idea that the murder of Jews held an unrivaled place in Nazi priorities. But if we are to seek to understand the perpetrators, and this was a point that Christopher Browning made, we need to be at least cognizant of the fact that Jews were not the only target, and to learn lessons where needed from the killings of other groups. The third major finding has been the striking degree of agency initiative can characterizing involvement in murder at all levels. Indeed, the emergence in the 1990s of the label perpetrator, replacing the older term of the functionary, reflected this newfound sense of the degree to which the participants owned their deeds. For one thing, most were not acting out of duress. For another, many went well beyond their orders in individual acts of cruelty and wanton behavior. Finally, many of the perpetrators were not just executing policy, but also making it. Our older view about the division of labor in the Holocaust, in which everyone was a mere cog in a system driven by orders given on high, thus revealed itself to be somewhat misleading. Certainly, it was important that individuals knew they were merely part of a much larger whole. Almost anyone was replaceable. But the fact remains that a great many participants were not simply following orders. In the middle ranks, individuals both followed orders and shaped policy. After the war, Nazis brought to justice were at pains to present themselves merely as loyal servants, as Eichmann did in Jerusalem in 1961. But during the war, and even after the war, as long as they were not in legal jeopardy, Eichmann is again a good example, since he offered a most grandiose view of his responsibilities to a former SS man and journalist who interviewed him in Argentina. They tended to portray themselves the other way around, as having even more power than in fact they possessed. The protagonists craved responsibility. None of this has made understanding the perpetrators easier. For one thing, it increases the diversity of reasons for participation. And this is particularly the case when we turn to collaboration, which was often driven by its own calculations and pressures. Where collaborators across Europe and in the Soviet Union were enlisted into paramilitary organizations operating at German behest, some of the institutional logic may mirror that of German bodies. But when we turn to communal violence, neighbor attacking neighbor, the cause and logic of violence was often different. But something that all these cases had in common is that whatever their individual disposition, individuals became caught up in processes larger than themselves. We also start to worry about what perpetrating actually means. Obviously, shooting women and children cross moral thresholds that say administering the removal of Jews from their homes before deportation or sequestering their property did not. But the energy and efficiency of the process and the engineering of dire deprivation drew on the actions of a great many participants who were not themselves directly killing. We might need to reflect on an even broader group than that, since in the last few years, historians have begun to pay particular attention to the importance of bystanders, something to which the psychologist Erwin Staub drew attention more than 30 years ago. Our inquiry thus raises larger questions about societal involvement in genocide, in which the action of the obvious perpetrator is only part of the puzzle. And even if we do focus our attention directly on killing, can we look at the person who pulls the trigger without considering the person who commands the unit and gives the order? Clearly, there is a difference between giving an order and carrying it out. The motives that drove Himmler to turn Hitler's vision into murderous reality will have differed at least in part from the pressures and incentives that led a low-ranking member of the security police to carry out his orders. But equally clearly, making policy and executing it were not cleanly divided. Killing, ordering to kill, and coming up with the policy that all should be killed cannot be cleanly separated. So what made the perpetrators kill? As in other genocides, most had not killed before the Holocaust, and most would not kill again afterwards. In part, they stopped killing because the German retreat removed Germans from the scenes of murder. But the end to killings was not just about loss of opportunity. The horrific and barely comprehensible story of the death marches, where murders continued until the last possible minute on German soil, but then stopped for good, offers a textbook case of the toxic brew of orders and individual agency. On the one hand, individual decisions to kill were made by local march leaders, sometimes abetted by local townspeople in the last weeks and even days of the war. And yet, when killing stopped, it stopped. Allied fears of murderous werewolves, namely renegade Nazis, continuing to fight on German soil, proved unnecessary. Germany almost instantly became safe territory for Jews. The flood of Jewish refugees from Poland in 1946 and 1947 to Germany reflected the expectation of safety in Germany. The story of the killers is thus a real puzzle. The most striking feature of the men who murdered the Jewish community of Buchach, writes Omer Bartov, was the seemingly unbridgeable discrepancy between their mundane pre-war and post-war lives and the astonishing brutality, callousness, and disdain for humanity they displayed during the occupation. Most of the killers were not deranged. The larger and more diverse we find the circle of those involved in killing to be, the less plausible is the idea that the killers belong to a special class of deviants. According to Harold Welzer, at most 10% were in any way psychologically abnormal. In that sense, monsters really weren't too. But if the perpetrators were of sound mind, were they nevertheless socially or culturally particularly predisposed to genocidal violence? Here, analysts are far less agreed, and a huge range of different explanations has come into play: social, psychological, political, structural, and many more. Broader cohort-based explanations tend not to work because of the political and social diversity of each generation and the multi-generational character of German perpetrators. But two significant subcohorts have been identified. One is a sizable subsection of First World War veterans who in the early post-First World War period were involved in paramilitary groups, the so-called Freikorps, fighting with ferocious violence against the left within Germany and in border disputes in the Baltics. Obviously, most First World War German combat veterans did not join the Freikorps, well under 5% in fact. But if we look at a sample of Nazi perpetrators, we find of those members of the front generation who were Nazis, some 30% had indeed fought in the Freikorps units. So a picture emerges of a strong subgroup of perpetrators with combat experience, early post-war involvement in political violence and atrocities, and a long Nazi trajectory. And many of the higher SS and police leaders match this profile, as do many of the Gauleiter. A second influential subgroup is formed by a network of younger men of the so-called war youth generation, born between 1900 and 1912, who entered university in the 1920s and belonged to right-wing political networks. Again, this is very much a subgroup of that generation. And this is the group first clearly identified by Ulrich Herbert and dubbed by Michael Wild the unconditional generation, the no-holds-barred generation. They dominated the SD, the Sicherheitsdienst, the think tank within the SS, that under Heydrich's leadership, Heydrich's the man sitting here, proved so important in developing anti-Semitic policy. The sub-cohorts defining earlier experiences were upheaval and national humiliation in 1918, and the economic and political uncertainties associated with the Weimar Republic. Many espoused what Heydrich's later subordinate Werner Best coined as heroic realism, the cool, rational, merciless pursuit of the interests of the people. In other words, although the members of this right-wing network were a long way from espousing genocide in the 1920s or early 1930s, they do bring with them values and styles that facilitated radicalization of policy in the 1930s and its ruthless implementation in the 1940s. These subcohorts have been identified amongst the middle and upper ranking echelons. For obvious career reasons, many of the lower ranking figures were younger, and they had no clear trajectory before the Nazi era. And almost 50% of those in a sample of perpetrators developed by Michael Mann at the NCO rank or lower, almost 50% joined the Nazi Party only during the war. And it's much harder to identify any clear characteristics separating this group. We wonder whether group profile really holds the primary answer to our quest, and in a way leads us in a different direction, away from special characteristics of the perpetrators and towards the political history of the Nazi movement before and after 1933 and the transformation of the society over which the Nazis presided. For most victims, there was little doubt that the problem lay not in this or that group, but in the Germans. From intellectuals who found themselves in Auschwitz like Primo Levi, or those living under German rule in Poland, to Jewish leaders in the ghettos like Avram Tori in Kovno, or to a reflective carpenter like the Treblinka survivor Jankiel Wiernik, to a young Polish Jewish boy like Michał Glowinski, all knew there was some essential link, all knew, I should say, there was some essential link between the perpetrators' inhumanity and their Germanity. And there's no doubt that they were observing pervasive behavior that was both utterly human and felt utterly unrecognizable, that came couched in German language and with cultural characteristics that were recognizably German. Even German Jewish observers wondered if something fundamentally wrong with German culture was being exposed. But was violent perpetration or genocide really pre-programmed in German culture? Efforts to establish a particular German trajectory, before we turn to the functioning of the Third Reich itself, often revolve around claims about a distinctive kind of anti-Semitism, for the most part at the level of Nazi policy, since the assumption is that racial biological anti-Semitism or redemptive anti-Semitism, in Saul Friedlander's words, were not necessarily universally shared, but decisive for Hitler and those involved at a higher level in shaping or carrying out Nazi policy. Goldhagen was distinctive in arguing that an eliminatory anti-Semitism was widely dispersed amongst the population. And the evidence that Goldhagen presented of enthusiastic participation, massive levels of cruelty, and widespread justification of violence against Jews was very powerful. There's no doubt that the contempt and hatred voiced for Jews by very large numbers of Germans in the field during the Holocaust was astonishing. But Jewish memory in Eastern Europe of the behavior of German soldiers during the First World War had often been rather positive. The extreme anti-Semitic violence to be found in parts of Europe in the early post-First World War period was not principally a German phenomenon, even if no one bested the Nazi Party when it came to radical anti-Semitic rhetoric. Studies of German electoral behavior before 1933 do not support the idea of overwhelming anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism was clearly a central part of Nazi ideology, and it clearly resonated amongst a goodly minority of the electorate. But as a mobilizer of widespread participation, it is as much a European story, something that bonded Germany and its allies, as something that can specifically explain what's going on here. So the point I want to make is in many ways a very simple and obvious one, and yet I think alters the way we understand what we mean by ordinary men. And that is that key institutions, but also wider society, transform rapidly under Nazi rule so that assumptions, outlooks, and choices were already different in 1939 than they had been in 1933 and would continue to evolve. In part, this is the older argument of cumulative radicalization articulated by Hans Mommsen. Particular institutions moved harder and faster than the rest. The insight of the older structuralist position was the way the regime fostered competition for advancement among ambitious subordinates. The key was to advance positions known to enjoy the Führer's favor. A variety of historians have shown how diverse were the participants in this competition, not least through Wolf Grüner's work on the municipalities. And the core of Michael Wildt's argument is that flexible and dynamic institutions created space and incentive for a like-minded cohort to advance rapidly towards more radical solutions. Of course, what Wildt and others have given us that is different from the older structuralist analysis is that, as noted above, we've become clear about the energy and intent which particular subcohorts brought with them. And so we're conscious of the players as well as the structures in which they found themselves. But the fact is that active protagonists in this process and ordinary citizens found themselves continuously revising their sense of what was acceptable, what was desirable. Today's unthinkable became tomorrow's essential. Many of those caught up in this process were initially not particularly violent, not until and if they were called up to serve in the East in some capacity. But I think it's crucial that the Nazi Party itself was a violent organization, and that I quote, from the earliest days of the party and into the war years, the symbiotic relationship between violence, competition, and male comradeship became manifest in the actions, rituals, and celebratory practices of Nazi paramilitary organizations, especially within the SA and the SS. In the 1930s, this was manifest in acts of humiliation by SS and policemen on the streets and in the concentration camps. During the war, this pattern was transplanted onto the killing fields. Of course, Nazi and SS organizations were not static entities, as pointed out, and were also at pains to shape and energize their members. And Jürgen Matthias, among others, have shown the importance of continued ideological messaging and teaching. In looking at the Nazis' ability to transform society, the importance of Hitler's democratic legitimation, his moral authority, and the movement's ability to appear to speak for Germany's collective good cannot be overestimated. In everything that followed, right up to the efficiency of killing operations in the East, Hitler's legitimacy and moral authority as the embodiment of Germany's collective good was critical. And that means also that the bystander, or perhaps better, the ordinary German civilian who echoed and reproduced the German regime's appeal and standing, was part of the societal transformation that made genocide possible. The point is not that everyone bought into all aspects of Nazi ideology. Hitler does seem to have been successful in persuading ordinary Germans that Jews were a global force, and that in entering World War, Germany found itself aligned against an international alliance of Jews. Ironically, it was the knowledge, particularly after Kristallnacht, that Germany had so viciously attacked its own Jews that made the idea of a Jewish front against Germany more plausible. But as important as the dissemination of ideas was the degree to which the Nazis succeeded in revolutionizing the individual's relationship to society and forcing each individual to stand up and be counted. This was something recognized already in the 1930s by Sebastian Haffner and reaffirmed more recently by János Stoiber. From salutes, greetings, charitable giving, behavior in public, dress, Sunday one-dish dinners, to organizational memberships, the Nazis' societal impact was visible everywhere, as much as many aspects of normal life might persist at the same time. Incidentally, German Jews, or those whom the Nazis treated as Jews, who experienced this social revolution and their own increasing exclusion, are superb sources for the historian. From Willi Cohn, Victor Klemperer, Walter Tausk, and many others, we see the mechanisms of adaptation and transformation that shift our attention away from the perpetrator to a much broader sense of participation and a societal echo chamber. Institutions and wider society felt the growth of tension, urgency, and more strident line drawing against the international Jewish threat in the second half of the 1930s as a result of Hitler's urgent push for war and conquest. War preparations and diplomatic risk-taking applied pressure to the system and led Hitler to part ways with more restrained conservative elites. Moments of high drama and the threat of war in the 1930s, or in the late 1930s, created acute domestic tension that translated into violence against the regime's supposed enemies, the explosive violence of Kristallnacht being the most extreme example. While a substantial element of the population may have been troubled at times by want and violence, Kristallnacht in particular offered a learning experience for many of what constituted acceptable violence against Jews. The final transition from quasi-genocidal territorial policies to outright mass murder took place during the war against the Soviet Union. So much came together at that moment. For one thing, Soviet communism was viewed as a Jewish system. That meant that for the first time, the security police's cleansing operations behind the lines now treated removing key enemy figures and eliminating Jews as coterminous. For another, and separate from any specifically anti-Jewish animus, short-term military logistics issues and medium-term aspirations for living space led to murderous economic planning. Military and civilian authorities envisaged the removal of food supplies from large swathes of civilians, and as we've seen, millions of Soviet prisoners of war died in German hands from hunger and disease as a result. Mindful of the challenge posed by the terrain, ferociously anti-communist and anti-Slav, and with its own tradition of ruthless elimination of partisans and civilian unrest, the Wehrmacht waged an increasingly unrestrained war against combatants and civilians alike. Increasingly, it became Wehrmacht dogma that partisans and Jews were overlapping categories. For his part, once he was confident that the Wehrmacht would not seek to rein in his policies, Himmler developed plans for German settlement that involved the removal of many ethnic populations in proportions ranging from a modest 50% to 100%. In short, the war against the Soviet Union was predicated on violence on a scale that, had it all been fully realized, might even have dissented the Holocaust in our imagination. Viewed against this backcloth, the famous debate between Goldhagen and Browning about what made the men of Police Battalion 101 tick thus seems skewed by Goldhagen's claim that the protagonists had imbibed eliminatory anti-Semitism with their mother's milk. Against that, Browning's emphasis on the ordinariness of the policeman stood out in sharp relief. But once we jettison the idea of inherited murderousness, however, and think about the expectations and behavior of ordinary men evolving in tandem with political, institutional, and societal change, Goldhagen's idea that the protagonists bring something specific with them to the table seems much less forced. Certainly, group pressures of conformity and comradeship played a role. For one thing, even for radicalized and politically hardline figures, the transition from violent rhetoric to reality on the ground could be a challenge. This was all the more so for ordinary, low-level policemen and soldiers. Fear of appearing weak, a desire not to let others in the group down, a basic assumption that orders from on high must be legitimate, all play a role. Such pressures would be felt in any male military or paramilitary organization, but were reinforced by the way that the Nazis succeeded in mobilizing the idea of comradeship, as authors like Sebastian Haffner and Thomas Kuhner have shown. The pressure of cognitive dissonance then helps create retrospective legitimation for the murders that you carried out. It remains true that one of the most troubling aspects of the Holocaust is how many people engaged in gratuitous torture and violence beyond the killing they were ordered to do. Eva Hoffman, born shortly after the war to Polish Jewish survivors, recalled in later life the stories of sadism and humiliation, extravaganzas of cruelty, and the bouts of brutal mockery and loutish laughter that accompanied the free-for-all massacres in Eastern European villages that survivors whispered to one another. It was the ubiquity of this wanton sadism and brutality that made so many Jewish observers sure that there was something utterly inhuman about the Germans. I have suggested that the Germans they confronted were ones that had participated in both, or lived through and endured, undergone, in both a political and societal radicalization. But even that takes us only so far. Alas, forcing victims to dance and sing, souvenir taking and mutilation were no preserve of German perpetrators, nor were they the preserve of the Holocaust, even if the precise forms of such ritual may be revealing and vary from perpetrator group to perpetrated group, genocide to genocide, or war to war. Denoting this kind of gratuitous cruelty as extra-lethal violence, in her work, Liane Fuji drew parallels with the rape and slaughter in Rwanda, the massacre of My Lai, and lynchings in 20th century North America. There is no simple explanation. Fuji herself used the language of ritual and carnival, and there's no doubt that transgression and victimization were treated as fun by the protagonists. The experience of power over life and death, and sometimes sexual motivations, may have been in the mix. Bartov notes that the passivity or vulnerability of the victims excited anger among the perpetrators. In short, beyond the story of the Holocaust and of the Third Reich's violence more broadly, there is an anthropological or a social psychological problem of human responses to situations where the lives of others can be extinguished with impunity. None of this, of course, is to belittle the victim's sense that they were confronted by monstrous deeds. Indeed, it reaffirms it. We should note, however, the victim testimony about the perpetrators is itself more differentiated than a first glance might suggest. Even the language of the beast is often not what it seems. For one thing, as the David Serakowiak quotation with which I opened reveals, the references in his case, and was quite often, to the Nazi beast in the singular, or to speak with Katzenelson, the Hydra with 1,000 heads. In other words, in full recognition that there was something systemic rather than individual in the monstrosity. For another, what was characterized as beastly varied. Sometimes it was wanton savagery. Sometimes it was the unfeeling and inhuman insistence on productivity or carrying on with orders. Sometimes it was simply the mindless execution of orders without any human reflection. In addition, the language of monster and beast was also often performative, a way of excluding from humanity those who were seeking to exclude the victims from humanity and seeking to treat the victims like beasts. Furthermore, those victims who had extensive exposure to their tormentors often offer us more precise and perceptive accounts of human behavior and human difference. They were well aware that there was variation. And Christopher Browning, in another outstanding book about the Sterachowice labor camp, shows that the prisoners were well aware that there were at least three major groups of perpetrators. There were sadists, a minority, but nevertheless significant. There were those who were corruptible, who were a fairly significant group, and there was a minority who showed some decency. And finally, we should note that in many accounts, victims and indeed after-war survivors withheld much analysis about the minds and motives of the perpetrators, precisely because they were aware it could only be speculative. For a post-war reckoning, facts were what was required, not speculation, and the facts of behavior were all too plain to see. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mark. This is really such a nuanced and insightful account. And as one of those people who precisely does the week on Browning and Ordinary Men, when I teach the Holocaust quite often, this really adds a lot to the way I think about perpetration, and I think will be something that I will draw on in my teaching for sure, as well as thinking more broadly. So one of the things that you emphasize is a kind of radical transformation that you see taking place, I think, especially across the 1930s. And if I understand correctly, what you're suggesting is that one of the keys to understanding the perpetration of the Holocaust can be found in the way that, as you say, the Nazis succeeded in revolutionizing the individual's relationship to society. So I wondered if you could just say a little bit more about that, the particular kinds of transformations that you see in this period and how they lead toward to this shift toward genocidal violence.
Okay, absolutely. I mean, I should say that some of this is still a little bit tentative. This is something that I'm thinking through myself. So, you know, it may be that some of this I will rethink, and clearly one has to bear in mind that Austrians are no slouches in their role in the organizations, and until 1938, they're not subject to the same transformation, although everything happens then very fast thereafter. But I think what recent work has shown, and I said I was particularly impressed by the book by Janos Steuer. The English edition is coming out this year with Indiana University Press, I'm pleased to say, reminds us that beyond the evidence that people have particularly bought into this or that aspect of Nazi ideology, and I think it's an important distinction, they had been used to the society itself, and this was an insight that he drew from Sebastian Haffner back in the 1930s, that every individual had got used to having to stand up and be counted, and that every individual had been confronted with the need to draw lines between those who are the in-groups and those who are the out-groups. And every individual has also become accustomed to social practices in which violence is not necessarily present, but it's in the background. Now, exactly how that works through and works its way through, and finding the evidence that shows exactly in individual cases what that meant, I think that's complicated, and it's not the case that I'm sort of at the point where I can nail everything. But what does strike me is it does seem odd, given the knowledge now that we have of what almost every ordinary German had been through in the 1930s, to imagine that as they enter the killing fields, they are you and me, and the social psychology is the same, which is not to say that recognizable social psychological processes take place. And it's clearly not to say that had it not been for situational orders, these people would have gone on a killing spree. Quite obviously they hadn't. Nevertheless, it seemed to me important. It's a sort of ironic in a way, because when Hans Mommsen and others were using the example of cumulative radicalization, because they were very conscious of the sort of political processes, the assumption in the background is that the protagonists were completely ordinary, and therefore they weren't really worth looking at, because what was going on was the dynamics within the system, and the disagreement was what the dynamics were. The one side said it was about how Hitler mobilized his followers and got them to implement his plan. The other was about how a centripetal and centrifugal system, the centripetal bit being Hitler's charisma, the centrifugal bit being unhinged structures in which people could compete with each other to demonstrate that they were the radicals and they owned the true hard line, led to the outcome. But the assumption was that the folk involved, if they had any particular characteristics, they were a bit ruthless, or they were ambitious, or whatever, and that below the top level there was no point looking at them at all. Whereas, in a way, what I'm arguing is some of those arguments about mechanisms feel to me very plausible, but what one needs to think about is what these processes actually mean for the outlook and thinking and responses of ordinary people. In other words, it's not just an institutional process, it's also a process which in different ways, and once you think beyond the institutions to the societal level with a wide remit, affect a large group. So that there's a slightly ironic enlisting of an older view, but in a way that I think is relevant also thinking about perpetrators at the ordinary level.
Mm-hmm. And I really like the emphasis that you put on the kind of ordinary German citizen and the role that those citizens play in the larger kind of legitimation of the vision that made all of this possible. So a kind of consent to what was happening emerges, it seems like, as a powerful force, right? As you say, in the democratic legitimacy and moral authority of Hitler.
And I would just I note that Saul Friedlander won this wonderful prize. I forget, it's the Bolson Prize. I forget the exact name, but part of the remit was that he used some of the prize money to support research projects. And in fact, the project that he's supporting is precisely a big one about bystanders. So I think this really is an important and growing area.
Right, and that is a nice segue actually to the next question I wanted to ask, which has to do with what Saul Friedlander called the integrated approach to the Holocaust. And as I mentioned in my introduction, I was really struck in rereading and reflecting on your work in anticipation of this lecture, how much, especially your work as a whole, but also at a more micro level, is really seems to me in line with that integrated approach. In other words, that you talk about perpetrators, you have books about victims, you have books about rescuers. Here you're putting also a certain degree of emphasis on these sort of implicated bystanders, as I might say. Does that accord with your own sense of what your work is about, and could you say a little bit about how that integrated approach is relevant to this question of the perpetrator, right? Taken not, I guess, in isolation, but as part of this larger dynamic of different subject positions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think like most historiographical characterizations, integrated is both useful in some ways and a shibboleth in others. Yes, a very generous characterization of my work, and certainly I like to think that I've been multi-perspectival and so approached it from these different vantage points, and certainly wanted to think both about the policy makers, the perpetrators, and the victims, and so on. On the other hand, in some ways, integrated history is a strange term to bring to what is the most sort of unintegrated human phenomenon almost in human history, to the perpetrators whose vision of the victims is so utterly divorced from reality, and who are driven by imperatives that deny the victims any place to life, and for the victims, from their point of view, so in many ways so utterly excluded from being able to see behind the machinery that is ending their chance to life, and of course having to make sense of it in the extremity of being killed. So it's so in that way it's the most disintegrated historical phenomenon ever. And so some of my other work, where I've looked in a much more sort of extended way at how the victims make sense of the perpetrators, tries to mediate between these two positions, that on the one hand we can learn a lot by seeing what they see, because they see variation. Sometimes they see the difference between what people say in public and what they say in private. They see the corruption which doesn't appear in the official records. There are so many ways in which victims are able to shed light on the perpetrators, but at the same time, often what they're writing, what they're seeing, is a reflection as much of their own predicament as it is of the other side, because they can't, you can't possibly read it. So there's this amazing account by one of the members of the Auschwitz Sonderkommando who took part in one of the uprisings, but he put one of these so-called scrolls of Auschwitz, the writings that were found after the liberation of the camp by people who've been in the Sonderkommando, and he describes, I think it's Leve Langfoot. I'm blanking on the name of the author, but he describes how he came to Auschwitz, and there's an account of how the train of the victims going to Auschwitz and a German troop train happened to be opposite each other on different sides of the platform. And to me, that was, a fantastic metaphor of this utter separation. And now he very eloquently imagines himself in the head of those and sort of rhetorically speaks about what the German soldiers are saying about the Jews, and it's very moving. Equally clearly, he hasn't a clue what is in the heads of those soldiers, and so that's a powerful moment in which what I can talk about is the image of the perpetrator that was held in a victim who managed to put down words in a situation of utter extremity. So it's very powerful. And it belongs in the history, so that's integrated, but it's vision that can hardly meet. These are separate trajectories, and so I think the term works as long as we're cognizant that it's at the same time such an utterly unintegratable history.
Oh, that's really fascinating. Yeah, thank you for that. That's really provocative, actually, but convincing too. If you'll bear with us, I have two more questions I'd love to pose, and they're both sort of comparative in different ways. The first one has to do with the role of non-German collaborators in the Holocaust and how that maybe changes or doesn't change the picture of perpetration that you're painting for us here. You focus in the talk, of course, for the most part, on German-specific dynamics, and that makes a lot of sense. The Holocaust was undoubtedly a German or initiated project. There's no controversy about that. And yet, on the other hand, there's been a lot of interest in recent years, as I understand it, from historians in the Europe-wide nature of the events and of the fairly vast participation of non-Germans in the genocide. So, how important is that history of non-German collaboration to understanding the perpetration of the Holocaust, and how might it, inflect our understanding of perpetrators?
Absolutely, I think it's extremely important, and so in a way, what you have to do is you have to write this kind of history that I've been offering here, a parallel history of the enabling contexts in other societies, and that might be about the transformative experience of these brief periods of Soviet rule and the aftermath of Soviet rule and that strip of territory that after 1939 passed into Soviet hands and then passes into Nazi hands. It might have to do with the long history of inter-ethnic tensions, and this would be the kind of story that Omer Bartov would tell in his study of Buchach about the sort of the experience of violence and conflict and line drawing in territory that in these shatter zones of empire, where what had been multi-ethnic imperial territories become now fragile and contested national territories with majorities and minorities. It would have to do with the sort of the political histories of authoritarian regimes and their crises in the 1930s in Romania and in Hungary. I mean, so there would be a whole series of other stories that one would have to tell where there's seen evidence of energetic participation that has an energy and a force and a dynamic that suggests that participants really are bringing something to the table, and I think that work is being done. So in other words, you know, part of the sort of tragedy of the Holocaust is that the Nazis were operating in a world in which some of the things that they were saying about Jews and ethnic clearing and anti-communism made sense to many others, and in which their aspirations are in these shatter zones of empire, where a great deal of things are up for grabs and a lot of instability has already preceded it. And you know, Jeffrey Weidling has just recently written this wonderful book about the violence against Jews in the post-First World War pogroms, again a sign of how a new set of conditions was creating the possibility for energized involvement in anti-Jewish violence there. And obviously the conditions are different. There's no direct continuity, but it reminds us that the Nazis are entering territory with their own histories, their own experiences that enable participation. So there's no sense here that I'm arguing that there's only one route to this violence, and that's where I think Daniel Goldham's book was so misleading, and I think he missed an opportunity, because I think he could have absolutely, you know, the evidence that he had of what people said and what they did was so strong, and he could so made such a strong argument about the tension between a sort of assumptions and so on that people bring with, and the institutional framework in which they're now acting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I appreciate very much the way you're kind of historicizing and particularizing and pushing back to a certain degree against, you know, what you describe as the universal social psychology that I think you're right that you see in something like Ordinary Men, which is very compelling on the one hand, but I understand the case for a historicization of some of those questions. At the same time, you know, I also find myself pushing back a little bit, and this would be my last question, kind of opening things up a little bit, because when you teach comparatively, as I've been doing in recent years, a course on political violence in the modern world, where we explore the relationship between different cases, and we've looked at the Armenian genocide, we've looked at the mass violence in Indonesia in the mid-60s, we've looked at the Rwandan genocide. This year, we're looking at the end of Yugoslavia and the Guatemalan Maya genocide of the 1980s. These are all very different cases from each other. There's no doubt about that, and there's no, you know, that no one has any desire to collapse them into each other. And yet, what you do see in these different scenarios is, you know, frighteningly similar forms of extreme violence, I guess, that have a lot of overlapping characteristics, at least with those that we are familiar with as Holocaust scholars. And So I guess and of course, you could say these are all particular histories and you could trace them, and one should do that, and one does do that, of course. And yet at the same time, it does make me wonder about, maybe not the universal, but at least generalizable characteristics that might be found, or that we might want to find or think about in thinking about perpetration. So I just wonder about those sorts of comparative approaches to political violence. You allude to them briefly here, but what kind of role they play in your thinking about these?
Yeah. No, I think that, or I'm very conscious that I need to sort of flesh this out further, do more thinking about this. But I mean, Lian Fuji, one of her lines, and I like the idea, but I haven't sort of pursued it far enough, is that the extra lethal forms of extra lethal violence, as she calls it, this wanton going beyond even what you're called upon to do. So there's this double thing of the capacity to enact and then the desire to go beyond, that often has distinctive forms, and that those distinctive forms can be revealing about the circumstances that give rise to the violence. And I'm not absolutely certain that is so, but I think it's possible that it's so. So it could be that even at that level of extreme, one would always need to be, and I mean, clearly there are some things that one can see the different place that rape and sexual violence has in different, because although it's being recovered now as a feature of the Holocaust, it clearly has a different place in the story to some of the other atrocities that one looks at. So it's conceivable that and then in a way, because I think what one wants to distinguish between is the point that the horror is no preserve of any one atrocity, which is, I mean, I think that's part of it. And that human beings have proven themselves willing to engage in horrific actions against other groups across moral thresholds that one would think not crossable in many different contexts, and that's incontestable. And so no specific explanation based in this or that evolution is going to work if what we want to explain is humans' moral capacity to be, or capacity to be horrific. I mean, so on one hand, there's that. On the other hand, the form that it takes, the way that people come to it, what they add on to it, how they legitimate and imagine the project that they're engaged in, all those things can be highly specific, and so I think the difficulty is sort of trying to find the balance between these two things. In other words, what's the universal thing that you want to explain that does go beyond, and what's the nationally specific? And I don't have a clear line there yet, and maybe I never will. But I mean, I absolutely recognize what you're saying and the issue, and I think the biggest challenge to what I'm saying is those examples where the violence absolutely seems to come out of nowhere. In other words, if you can find the case where there seems to be so little preparation. Now, obviously, in some ways, historians always, with 20/20 hindsight, means historians always manage to find some kind of precedent for whatever phenomenon. But that clearly, the degree to which there's sort of ideological, institutional, societal preparation varies, and I think that's the sort of test case. In other words, if you could find as a fairly universal that most or nearly all or all comparable examples have their own clear prehistory, then this is how you would fit the Holocaust into that. If you can't, then that does rather then that raises a question about the idea of at least the necessity of some kind of transformative process, and I'm not so sure there. That's I don't yet have the comparative sense strongly enough to absolutely nail that. But I think that's the interesting area.
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you so much. There's so much to think about here. I think everyone who listens will really learn a lot from this. So the only problem, of course, was that you're not here with us live and with a live audience, but I'm glad we did this anyway. Thank you so much, Mark Roseman, for your annual 1939 Society lecture, for being with us today. And it's been really a fascinating discussion.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure, and I'm sorry that I couldn't be there in person.